On Thursday, April 4th, having called on Dr. Johnson, I said, "It was a pity that truth was not so firm as to bid defiance to all attacks, so that it might be shot at as much as people choose to attempt, and yet remain unhurt." Johnson said, "Then, sir, it would not be shot at. Nobody attempts to dispute the 2 and 2 make 4, but with contexts concerning moral truth, human passions are generally mixed, and therefore it must ever be liable to assault and misrepresentation." This is true. On Friday, April 5th, being Good Friday, after having attended the morning service at St. Clement's Church, I walked home with Johnson. We talked of the Roman Catholic religion. Johnson said, "In the barbarous ages, sir, priests and people were equally deceived, but afterwards there were gross corruptions introduced by the clergy, such as indulgencies to priests to have concubines, and the worship of images not indeed inculcated, but knowingly permitted." He strongly censured the licensed stews at Rome. I said, "So then, sir, you would allow us no irregular intercourse whatever between the sexes?" Intercourse. Johnson said, "To be sure I would not, sir. I would punish it much more than is done, and so restrain it. In all the countries there have been fornication, as in all countries there have been theft. But there may be more or less of the one as well as of the other, in proportion to the force of law. All men will naturally commit fornication, as all men will naturally steal. And, sir, it is very absurd to argue, as has been often done, that prostitutes are necessary to prevent the violent effects of appetite from violating the decent order of the life. Nay, should be permitted, in order to preserve the chastity of our wives and daughters. Depend upon it, sir, severe laws, steadily enforced, would be sufficient against these evils, and would promote marriage." Okay, Johnson. I feel like Johnson is wrong, or at least seems very out of date 75% of the time. But Boswell seems way more wrong more often, I should say. I stated to him this case: suppose a man had a daughter who he knew had been seduced, but her misfortune is concealed from the world. Should he keep her in his house? Would he not, by doing so, be accessory to imposition? And perhaps a worthy, unsuspecting man might come and marry this woman unless the father informed him of the truth. Johnson answered, "Sir, he is accessory to no imposition. His daughter is in his house, and if a man courts her, he takes his chance. If a friend, or indeed if any man, asks his opinion whether he should marry her, he ought to advise him against it, without telling why, because his real opinion is then required. Or, if he has other daughters who know of her frailty, he ought not to keep her in his house. You are to consider the state of life as this: we are to judge of one another's characters as well as we can, and a man is not bound, in honesty or honor, to tell us the faults of his daughter or of himself. A man who has debauched his friend's daughter is not obliged to say to everybody, 'Take care of me, don't let me into your houses without suspicion. I once debauched a friend's daughter, I may debauch yours.'" All right, point taken. Mr. Thrale called upon him, and appeared to bear the loss of his son with a manly composure. There was no affectation about him, and he talked, as usual, upon indifferent subjects. He seemed to me to hesitate as to the intended Italian tour, on which, I flattered myself, he and Mrs. Thrale and Dr. Johnson were soon to set out. And therefore I pressed it as much as I could. I mentioned that Mr. Beauclerk had said that Baretti, whom they were to carry with them, would keep them so long in the little towns of his own district that they would not have time to see Rome. I mentioned this to put them on their guard. I don't know why Boswell's trying to put them on their guard, but okay. Johnson said, "I think he's jealous. Is he jealous that they're going?" Anyway, Johnson said, "Sir, we do not thank Mr. Beauclerk for supposing that we are to be directed by Baretti. No, sir, Mr. Thrale is to go, by my advice, to Mr. Jackson, the all-knowing, and get from him a plan for seeing the most that can be seen in the time that we have to travel. We must, to be sure, see Rome, Naples, Florence, and Venice, and as much more as we can. Speaking with a tone of animation. He was speaking with a tone of animation there. Footnote here. Mr. Jackson, a gentleman who, from his extraordinary stores of knowledge, has been styled omniscient. Johnson, I think, very properly altered it to all-knowing, as it is verbum solemne, appropriated to the Supreme Being. When I expressed an earnest wish for his remarks on Italy, Johnson said, I do not see that I could make a book upon Italy. Yet I should be glad to get £200 or £500 by such a work. This showed both that a journal of his tour upon the continent was not wholly out of his contemplation, and that he uniformly adhered to the strange opinion which his indolent disposition made him utter, quote, no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. Unquote. Numerous instances to refute this will occur to all who are visited in the history of literature. He gave us one of the many sketches of characters which were treasured in his mind, and which he was wont to produce quite unexpectedly in a very entertaining manner. I lately, said he, received a letter from the East Indies from a gentleman whom I formerly knew very well. He had returned from that country with a handsome fortune, as it was reckoned, before means were found to acquire those immense sums which had been brought from thence of late. He was a scholar and an agreeable man, and lived very prettily in London, till his wife died. After her death he took to dissipation and gaming, and lost all he had. One evening he lost £1,000 to a gentleman whose name I am sorry I have forgotten. Next morning he sent the gentleman £500, with an apology that it was all he had in the world. The gentleman sent the money back to him, declaring he would not accept it, and adding that if Mr. Blank had occasion for £500 more, he would lend it to him. He resolved to go out again to the East Indies, and make his fortune anew. He got a considerable appointment, and I had some intention of accompanying him. And I thought then, as I do now, I should have gone. But at that time I had objections to quitting England. And that man was Joseph Falk, according to this footnote. And now you know the rest of the story. It was a very remarkable circumstance about Johnson, whom shallow observers have supposed to have been ignorant of the world, that very few men had seen greater variety of characters. And none could observe them better, as was evident from the strong, yet nice portraits which he often drew. I have frequently thought that if he had made out what the French call un catalogue raisonné of all the people who had passed under his observations, it would have afforded a very rich fund of instruction and entertainment. The suddenness with which his accounts of some of them started out in conversation was not less pleasing than surprising. I remember he once observed to me, "It is wonderful, sir, what it is to be found in London. The most literary conversation that I ever enjoyed was at the table of Jack Ellis, a monody scrivener behind the Royal Exchange, with whom I am at one period used to dine generally once a week." Footnote from Boswell about this. This Mr. Ellis was, I believe, the last of the profession called scriveners, which is one of the London companies, but of which the business is no longer carried on separately, but is transacted by attorneys and others. He was a man of literature and talents. He was the author of a Hudrabrastic version of Morpheus's Canto, in addition to the Aeneid, of some poems in Dodsley's collections, and various other small pieces. But, being a very modest man, never put his name to anything. He showed me a translation which he had made of Ovid's epistles, very prettily done. There is a good engraved portrait of him by Peter from a picture by Fry, which hangs in the hall of the Scribner's Company. I visited him October 4th, 1790, in his 93rd year, and found his judgment distinct and clear, and his memory, though fated so as to fail him occasionally, yet, as he assured me, and I indeed perceived, able to serve him very well, after a little recollection. It was agreeable to observe that he was free from the discontent and fretfulness which too often molest old age. He was in the summer of the year walked to Rotherhithe, where he dined and walked home in the evening. He died on the 31st of December, 1791. Back to the story at hand. Volumes would be required to contain a list of the Johnson's numerous and various acquaintances, none of whom he ever forgot, and could describe and discriminate them all with precision and vivacity. He associated with persons the most widely different in manners, abilities, rank, and accomplishments. He was at once the companion of the brilliant Colonel Forster of the Guards, who wrote The Polite Philosopher, and of the awkward and uncouth Robert Levitt, of Lord Thurlow and Mr. Sastres, the Italian master, and had dined one day with the beautiful, gay, and fascinating Lady Craven, and the next with good Mrs. Gardiner, the tallow chandler on Snow Hill. Footnote about Lady Craven. Lord Macartney, who, with his own distinguished qualities, is remarkable also for an elegant pleasantry, told me that he met Johnson at Lady Craven's, and that he seemed jealous of any interference. So, said his lordship, smiling, I kept back. On my expressing my wonder at his discoveries so much of the knowledge peculiar to different professions, Johnson told me, I learned what I know of law chiefly from Mr. Barlow, a very able man. I learned some, too, from Chambers, but was not so teachable then. One is my not willing to be taught by a young man. When I expressed a wish to know more about Mr. Ballow, Johnson said, Sir, I have seen him but once these 20 years. The tide of life has driven us different ways. I was sorry at the time to hear this, but whoever quits the creeks of private connections and fairly gets into the great ocean of London will, by imperceptible degrees, unavoidably experience such cessations of acquaintance. Footnote here about Mr. Ballow. There's an account of him in Sir John Hawkins' Life of Johnson. Oh, Boswell hasn't shat on that Life of Johnson in a while. John Hawkins' version. First time I think he's mentioned it in a couple hundred pages, actually. My knowledge of physicians, Johnson added, I learned from Dr. James, who I helped in writing the proposals for his dictionary and also a little in the dictionary itself. I also learned some from Dr. Lawrence, but was then grown more stubborn. Footnote here about the dictionary. Boswell saying, I have in vain endeavored to find out what parts Johnson wrote for Dr. James. Perhaps medical men may. A curious incident happened today while Mr. Thrale and I sat with him. Francis announced that a large packet was brought to him from the post office, said to have come from Lisbon, and it was charged £7 10 shillings. Johnson would not receive it, supposing it to be some trick, nor did he even look at it. But upon inquiry afterwards, he found that it was a real packet for him, from that very friend in the East Indies of whom he had been speaking. In the ship which carried it having come to Portugal, this packet, with others, had been put into the post office at Lisbon. I mentioned a new gaming club of which Mr. Beauclerk had given me an account, where the members played to a desperate extent. Johnson said, Depend upon it, sir, this is mere talk. Who is ruined by gaming? You will not find 6 instances in any age. There is a strange rout made about deep play, whereas you have many more people ruined by adventurous trade, and yet we do not hear such an outcry against it. Thrale said, There may be few people absolutely ruined by deep play, but very many are much hurt in their circumstances by it. Johnson said, Yes, sir, and so are very many by other kinds of expense. I had heard him talk once before in the same manner, and at Oxford he said he wished he had learned to play at cards. The truth, however, is that he loved to display his ingenuity in argument, and therefore would sometimes in conversation maintain opinions which he was sensible were wrong, but in supporting which his reasoning and wit would be most conspicuous. He would begin thus. Why, sir, as to the good or evil of card-playing. Now, said Garrick, he is thinking which side he shall take. He appeared to have a pleasure in contradiction, especially when any opinion whatever was delivered with an air of confidence, so that there was hardly any topic, if not one of the great truths of religion and morality, that he might not have been incited to argue, either for or against it. Lord Elibeck, Patrick Lord Elibeck, who died in 1778, had the highest admiration of his powers. He once observed to me, whatever opinion Johnson maintains, I will not say that he convinces me, but he never fails to show me that he had good reasons for it. I have heard Johnson play his lordship this high compliment. I never was in Lord Elibeck's company without learning something. We sat together till it was too late for the afternoon service. Thrale said he had come with intention to go to church with us. We went at 7 to evening prayers at St. Clement's Church after having drank coffee, an indulgence which I understood Johnson yielded to on this occasion in compliments to Thrale. On Sunday, April 7th, Easter Day, after having been at St. Paul's Cathedral, I came to Dr. Johnson, according to my usual custom. It seemed to me that there was always something peculiarly mild and placid in his manner upon this holy festival, the commemoration of the most joyful event in the history of our world, the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, who, having triumphed over death in the grave, proclaimed immortality to mankind. I repeated to him an argument of a lady of my acquaintance, who maintained that her husband, having been guilty of numerous infidelities, released her from conjugal obligations because they were reciprocal. Footnote here tells us this is Professor Pottle and Dr. Bennett suggest that... Professor Pottle and Dr. Bennett suggest that he's talking about Jane, Countess of Eglinton. Anyway, Johnson said, "This is miserable stuff, sir. To the contract of marriage, besides the man and wife, there is a third party, society, and it is to be considered as a vow, God. And if it is to be considered as a vow, God. And therefore it cannot be dissolved by their consent alone. Laws are not made for particular cases, but for men in general. A woman may be unhappy with her husband, but she cannot be freed from him without the approbation of the civil and ecclesiastical power. A man may be unhappy because he is not so rich as another, but he is not to seize upon another's property with his own hand." Okay. I said, "But, sir, the lady does not want that the contract should be dissolved. She only argues that she may indulge herself in gallantries with equal freedom as her husband does, provided she takes care not to introduce a spurious issue with his family. You know, sir, what Macrobius has told us of Julia. Ninquam enim nisi navi pluvi tolo victorum. I never take on a passenger but when the ship is full." Johnson answered, "This lady of yours, sir, I think is very fit for a brothel." Wow. Tough words. Mr. Macbean, author of the Dictionary of Ancient Geography, came in. He mentioned that he had been 40 years absent from Scotland. "Ah, Boswell," said Johnson, smiling, "what would you give to be 40 years from Scotland?" I said, "I should not like to be so long absent from the seat of my ancestors." This gentleman, Mrs. Williams, and Mr. Levitt dined with us. Dr. Johnson made a remark which both Mr. Macbean and I thought new. It was this, that, quote, "the law against usury is for the protection of creditors as well as of debtors. For if there were no such check, people would be apt from the temptation of great interest to lend to desperate persons, by whom they would lose their money. Accordingly, there are instances of ladies being ruined by having injudiciously sunk their fortunes for high annuities, which after a few years ceased to be paid in consequence of the ruined circumstances of the borrower. Mrs. Williams was very peevish, and I wondered at Johnson's patience with her now, as I had often done on similar occasions. The truth is that his humane consideration of the forlorn and indignant state in which this lady was left by her father induced him to treat her with the utmost tenderness, and even to be desirous of procuring her amusement, so as to sometimes to incommode many of his friends by carrying her with him to their houses, where, from her manner of eating, in consequence of her blindness, she could not but offend the delicacy of persons of nice sensations. A.k.a. she ate like a pig. Anyway, till next time, bye from Boswell.